Some art, it just doesn't feel like something you just look at. It feels like you're invited into it somehow. Like the painting is asking you to step forward, bring your own feelings, your own thoughts, and sort of meet it halfway.
Yeah, exactly. And there's that quote from the artist we're diving into today, isn't there? The artist should paint not only what he sees before him, but also what he sees within him.
That really captures it, that internal vision being just as important.
Absolutely. It's about that connection between the outer observation and the inner resonance,
And the artist who maybe embodied that more than anyone else in his generation is Caspar David Friedrich, German romantic landscape painter.
Yeah.
Hugely important.
Considered the most important German artist of his time, yeah. And we've got quite a stack of materials. You listeners have shared articles, exhibition notes, bits of research to really try and understand him.
So our mission today is, well, it's to explore his life, of course, but maybe more importantly, to unpack his really unique way of seeing nature, of painting it.
And to grasp those powerful themes he kept coming back to and figure out why his work, why it still feels so incredibly relevant even now.
Okay, let's get into it. Starting right at the beginning. Friedrich was born September 5th, 1774, in Greifswald. That's a town right on the Baltic coast.
Right, and at that time, it was actually Swedish Pomerania, not Germany proper.
Interesting detail. He was the 6th of 10 kids, apparently raised in a pretty strict Lutheran household.
And his early life, well, the sources really emphasize this, it was marked by quite a bit of tragedy, significant loss.
Yeah, I saw that. He lost his mother when he was only, 7?
7, yeah. And then 2 of his sisters died not long after that.
And then there's that really awful story when he was 13 about his brother, Johann Christopher.
Drowning after falling through the ice. And some accounts, some sources suggest that his brother was actually trying to rescue Caspar David himself at the time.
Wow. That kind of loss, especially with that potential layer of, guilt or just intense trauma, that has to shape you, doesn't it?
You think so. And the sources definitely point to themes of death, loss, melancholy appearing again and again in his art later on. Makes you wonder
how much that specific moment, on the ice lingered when he painted those vast, sometimes pretty treacherous frozen landscapes later.
Exactly. Yeah. So he starts his formal art training locally in Greifswald around 1790, studies with Johann Gottfried Quistorp.
And Quistorp seems like a key early influence.
Very much so. The sources note Quistorp actually took his students outdoors to sketch directly from life. That was quite forward-thinking then.
Right, getting them out of the studio, building those observation skills.
And Quistorp also introduced him to the ideas of Ludwig Gothard Kossegarten.
Who was he?
A theologian who saw nature as basically a revelation of God. You can see that thread running right through Friedrich's work, can't you?
Immediately. Nature is divine communication.
Yeah. And he also learned about 17th century artists like Adam Elsheimer artists who put religious subjects into these big dominant landscapes, sometimes night scenes. Plus, Friedrich was studying literature and aesthetics too.
So a really rich foundation there. Direct observation, nature theology, artistic precedent.
A potent mix. After Greifswald, he heads off to Copenhagen. Spends 4 years there, 1794 to 98, at the Academy.
A big step up, presumably.
Definitely expanded his world. He got access to the Royal Picture Gallery there, saw those influential 17th century Dutch landscapes firsthand, formal training too, copying sculptures, life drawing.
And his teachers there?
Influenced by Sturm and Drang, Storm and Stress. That movement emphasizing intense emotion, mood. They drew on things like Norse mythology too.
Okay, so you can really see the seeds of that romantic mood landscape, that Stimmungslandschaft being sown.
Absolutely. After Copenhagen, 1798, he makes a big move, settles permanently in Dresden. And this is where he really starts finding his own voice.
Right. What was he doing initially?
Well, experimenting quite a bit, actually. Printmaking, etchings, and interestingly, woodcuts. His brother, who was a furniture maker, apparently cut the blocks for him.
Oh, that's fantastic. A little family collaboration.
It is, isn't it? But for those early years, he mostly worked in ink, watercolor, sepia. The sources mentioned he didn't really jump into oils in a big way until his reputation was already building.
Okay. And landscapes were his focus from the start.
Primarily, yeah. Based on these frequent trips he took back to the Baltic coast, Bohemia, into the mountains. Really focused on those northern German scenes.
Woods, hills, harbors.
Exactly. And especially the light. The sources point out that his sketches were super detailed, almost topographical even, but those really subtle atmospheric effects, the specific light on the clouds or the water on the Baltic coast, that often came from memory, back in the studio.
Oh, so right from the beginning, it's that blend. Meticulous observation out there, but then the internal impression, the feeling, shaping it back in the studio.
Precisely.
Mm-hmm.
Memory wasn't just recall. It was about recapturing an essence, an effect. Things start picking up for him around 1805.
That's the Weimar competition with Goethe.
Yeah. He won a prize there, organized by Goethe himself. And Goethe was apparently really impressed, particularly with his sepia drawings like Procession at Dawn, praised his resourcefulness, neatness.
High praise from Goethe is pretty good. But then comes his first major oil painting, right? The Techen altar, 1808.
Yes, commissioned as an actual altarpiece, a landscape across on a mountain peak intended for a church.
And this is where things get controversial.
Very. The sources make it clear it got a really cool reception. Critics, especially these one guy, Basilius von Ramdor, were pretty outraged.
Outraged. Why?
Because he dared to put a landscape painting on an altar. Ramdor called it a veritable presumption, basically asking, how dare mere landscape painting sneak into the church and creep onto the altar?
Wow. It seems strange to us now, but I guess putting nature, not traditional religious figures, front and center in that sacred space felt disruptive.
Hugely disruptive for the time. And this pushback actually prompted Friedrich to do something rare. He wrote his only known detailed explanation of his own work in 1809.
To defend it.
He explained the symbolism, comparing the sun's rays hitting the cross to the light of God the Father, trying to justify its spiritual intent. And the sources note, interestingly, this controversial piece was one of the very few commissions he ever got.
Strange paradox. Causes a storm, but it's a rare commission. Did the controversy hurt him long term?
Doesn't seem like it entirely. Despite that, he gained more recognition. In 1810, the Prussian crown prince bought 2 paintings, which led to him becoming a member of the Berlin Academy.
Okay, so royal patronage helped.
Definitely. And then a slightly surprising move in 1816, he applied for Saxon citizenship in Dresden.
Why surprising?
Well, the sources point out that the Saxon government was pretty pro-French then, especially during the Napoleonic period. And Friedrich's art was already being seen as quite patriotic, quite anti-French.
Ah, so his politics seemed at odds with the local government's alignment.
Kind of, yeah. But he got the citizenship anyway, and membership in the Saxon Academy too, which came with a small yearly income.
But he never got that full professorship he wanted.
No, never did. The sources suggest maybe his very personal, very individual style wasn't seen as a great model for students. Or perhaps his focus on these very Germanic subjects clashed with those pro-French attitudes in official circles. Maybe a bit of both.
Politics and personal style may be holding him back institutionally, but by this point, those key themes, the things that really define his work, they were coming into sharp focus.
Oh, absolutely. This is where we really see his unique vision solidifying. He fundamentally changes landscape painting.
How so? It wasn't just about painting pretty scenes anymore.
Not at all. His goal, as the sources explain it, was to explore the sublime.
That feeling, awe, maybe a bit of terror, when you face nature's immense power or scale.
Exactly that. And he saw experiencing the sublime as a way to reconnect with your spiritual self, your inner self, by contemplating nature. He basically elevated landscape from just a backdrop to the main event, the carrier of deep emotion and meaning.
And he had that specific technique, the sources mention it a lot, for pulling the viewer right into that experience. The Rückenfigur.
Ah, yes, the figures seen from behind. It's such a clever device, isn't it? Because you don't see their face, you don't know their specific emotion.
So you can project yourself onto them.
Precisely. You, the viewer, can step right into their shoes, see the landscape through their eyes, feel that sublime potential firsthand. And the figure is often quite small in the painting.
Which emphasizes the vastness of the landscape around them.
It directs your gaze outward towards what the sources call a metaphysical dimension, something beyond just the physical scene.
It makes the painting instantly personal. You become that lone observer in that huge space. And that contributes to that whole feeling, that Die romantische Stimmungslandschaft, the romantic mood landscape.
Exactly. His paintings are just drenched in this romantic feeling. He paints German coasts, forests, mountains, often using them to explore religious ideas. His contemporaries definitely saw his work as expressing a kind of religious mysticism.
Which brings us back to that key quote again. The artist should paint not only what he sees before him, but also what he sees within him. And that bit about if he sees nothing within, he shouldn't paint what's before him either.
That's from his writings in 1830, and it's crucial. Nature was God's revelation, yes, but the artist's inner state, their spiritual eye, was essential to actually seeing and conveying that truth.
And the elements he uses, those huge skies, the mists, storms, forests, ruins, crosses, they're not just props, are they?
Not at all. The sources describe them as symbols, witnesses to his view of nature as this divine creation. They all carry weight.
And he developed this whole symbolic language, particularly around life, death, hope.
He really did. The sources list these recurring symbols of death, boats sailing away from the shore, kind of like Charon.
Ferrying souls across the Styx.
Right. Solitary poplar trees, those gnarled bare oak trees, tree stumps. You see them in paintings like Raven Tree or Man and Woman Contemplating the Moon.
And the abbey in the oak woods sounds particularly potent.
Oh, it is. Monks carrying a coffin, past an open grave, through the ruins of a Gothic church. It's heavy with mortality.
But it's not all bleakness, is it? The sources mention symbols of hope, too.
Definitely. The cross itself, obviously, is a symbol of redemption. But also things like a clearing sky or a sunrise often suggest eternal life. A slender moon can mean hope or the closeness of Christ. Anchors shown on the shore can represent spiritual hope.
So even in a painting like the Abbey in the Oakwood, there's a counterpoint.
Yes. The sources point out the procession is moving away from the grave towards the cross and the light on the horizon. It suggests a destination beyond death, a journey towards salvation.
He also seems to have completely changed how winter was painted.
He really did. Before Friedrich, winter scenes were often, peasant skating, people bustling about enduring the cold. Friedrich, the sources say, pioneered depicting winter as utterly stark, still, solemn, almost lifeless.
Scenes where no man has yet set his foot, as one source puts it.
Exactly. He focused on the wholly detached and distinctive features of nature in its dormant state, subordinating everything to that single, quiet, almost melancholic feeling of winter stillness.
That stillness is so powerful in his work. Now, this brings us to the idea of loneliness and melancholy that often surrounds him.
Yeah, that's a common interpretation, isn't it?
Yeah.
The sources note his life and art are often seen through that lens, linking it back to those early losses and maybe a generally bleak outlook. His appearance, too, apparently pale, withdrawn, probably fed into that image of the taciturn man.
And he did have periods of depression.
Yes, the sources mentioned recurring depressive episodes, and during those times, his themes would shift more vultures, owls, graveyards, ruins, and his colors would get darker, more muted.
But, like you said, the sources also give a more complex picture of the man himself.
They do. We get descriptions, like from Gotthelf Heinrich von Schubert, calling him a strange mixture, someone who could actually be quite humorous and fun, especially when talking about nature. His letters apparently show wit and self-irony, too.
So not just gloom and doom.
Not entirely. And some scholars, like Hubertus Gassner mentioned in the sources, argue for a positive, life-affirming subtext running through his work, maybe connected to his faith or even Freemasonry. So the melancholy was real, but it wasn't the whole picture.
Right. Another big theme, especially during certain years, was this engagement with German folklore and patriotism.
This really ramps up during the Napoleonic Wars, the French occupation. Friedrich was fiercely patriotic, very anti-French, and the sources highlight how he used landscape itself to express these political feelings.
Which was new, using landscape for political symbols.
Radically new for landscape painting then. He was influenced by anti-Napoleonic poetry and literature, and he started using motifs from the German landscape to celebrate German culture and history as a form of resistance. The sources call him the first artist to convey political messages only through landscape.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Old Heroes' Graves from 1812 is a key one. It shows a dilapidated monument inscribed Arminius, referencing the Germanic chieftain who beat the Romans, a huge symbol of German nationalism. There are 4 tombs nearby, slightly open, suggesting the spirits of heroes are, awake or freed. And importantly, down below, near a cave, are these tiny figures of French soldiers, sort of cut off from the light in the sky.
Wow, okay, the symbolism is pretty direct there.
It really is. Another one is Fir Forest with the French dragoon and the raven. Around 1813, you see this tiny lost French soldier dwarfed by this dense German forest, and there's a raven, a bird of ill omen, perched on a tree stump nearby.
Sending a clear message.
Definitely. He also depicted some friends, including his Russian friends, wearing what was called Old German clothing, wide berets, long cloaks. This attire was adopted by liberal students and academics as a symbol of the patriotic movement.
So he wasn't afraid to wear his heart or his politics on his canvas. Let's talk about some of his most famous works. Maybe start with Monk by the Sea.
Good place to start. The sources really emphasize this as a pivotal, groundbreaking painting. It's incredibly stark, isn't it? Just that tiny, tiny monk figure on the shore facing this vast, dark sea and sky that just merged together.
It's famous for that feeling of emptiness, that openness.
Exactly. The sources call it daringly empty, almost devoid of traditional landscape elements people expected then. And apparently he arrived at this simplicity deliberately. He initially had things like ships in the scene.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but he painted them out, stripped it right down to this bare, essential confrontation between the figure and the void.
To create that specific feeling.
Right. And because it's so open, so lacking in narrative detail, the sources call it a visual poem. It really invites you to project your own feelings onto it. As one source says, you project yourself, your own feelings, your own emotions into these paintings.
That must have been revolutionary, not telling the viewer what to feel, but creating a space for their feeling.
Absolutely radical for the time. Paintings were supposed to guide your emotions, tell a story. He just leaves this vast space. That's why some see it as almost a conceptual work, way ahead of its time, pointing towards abstraction, influencing artists down the line like Turner or, much later, Mark Rothko.
That Rothko connection feels strong standing before those huge silent color fields. And then there's the other really iconic one, Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog.
Ah, yes. Painted around 1817, maybe his most famous image. This one really encapsulates the sublime, the view. He's grand, awe-inspiring, maybe a little terrifying from that height, but also beautiful, exhilarating.
It feels both incredibly vast and somehow intimate.
That's the paradox the sources talk about. It's an intimate view of one person, but the subject is this immense, unknowable landscape. It speaks to that human desire to grasp the world, but also the impossibility of fully doing so. You notice the little details, like the wind in the wanderer's hair.
Yeah, it makes him feel real, relatable, even in that epic setting.
Exactly. The sources mention his visual power is so strong that people often expect the actual painting to be much bigger than it is.
Yeah, I can see that.
And apparently, maybe a bit tongue-in-cheek, some sources suggest this image, the figure looking out over a grand vista, has kind of influenced how we all take our vacation photos now.
Huh. I love that. The ultimate scenic selfie pose, perhaps.
Yeah.
So pulling back, his whole philosophy seems to boil down to this connection between observing nature closely and looking inward.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
His writings from 1830 really hammer this home. He said the artist needs to balance observing nature with introspection. Close your bodily eye, he wrote. See your picture first with the spiritual eye. Then bring to the light of day that which you have seen in the darkness.
So the inner vision comes first. Then you find its form in the outer world.
Mm-hmm. And he also felt that landscape painting shouldn't be too crammed with detail. You need to leave room, leave space for the viewer's imagination to work.
Now, shifting gears slightly, there's this really interesting Russian connection in his later career that the sources highlight.
Yes, this is super important, especially for his later life. Around 1820, he starts getting significant support and patronage from Russia.
And this began with Grand Duke Nikolai Pavlovich, the future Tsar Nicholas I, and his wife, Alexandra Feodorovna.
That's right. Alexandra was Prussian originally, Princess Charlotte, and her brother was the Prussian crown prince who had bought Friedrich's paintings earlier. So she knew his work from her childhood. When she and Nikolai visited his studio in Dresden in 1820, they bought several pieces. That started a really important relationship.
But the key figure seems to be the poet Vasily Zhukovsky.
Absolutely crucial friendship. They met in 1821. Zhukovsky was a major poet, tutor to the next Tsar, Alexander II. He instantly felt this connection, called Friedrich, a kindred spirit. Zhukovsky became a real champion for him.
How so?
He helped Friedrich financially, buying works himself, but also strongly recommending him to the royal family. This provided really vital support, especially later when Friedrich was struggling and his German patrons were falling away.
And Zhukovsky saw something different in Friedrich's art compared to some others.
Yeah, the sources point this out. While some focused only on the mystic or the melancholy, Zhukovsky really admired their precision. He said they please us by their precision, each of them awakening a memory in our mind. He saw the careful study of nature, not just gloom.
Interesting.
And Zhukovsky also described Friedrich the man differently, not perpetually gloomy, but open-hearted, funny sometimes, speaking about nature with real passion, like he was close kin to it. There's nothing dreamy in his pictures, Zhukovsky wrote surprisingly. On the contrary, they're attractive for their accuracy.
That really rounds out the picture of Friedrich himself. So their friendship led to paintings going to Russia.
Lots of them. Works like On a Sailing Boat And the sisters were bought early on, apparently, the story goes. They resonated with the Grand Duke and Alexandra's happy marriage. Later, Moonrise Over the Sea, Morning in the Mountains. Alexandra Fyodorovna even had some prominently displayed at her estate, Alexandria, near St. Petersburg, which was designed in this German-influenced neo-Gothic style.
And Zhukovsky introduced other Russians to Friedrich, too.
Yes, in 1826, he brought the writers Alexander and Sergei Turgenev to Friedrich's studio. They were part of these liberal patriotic circles in Russia and also felt a strong connection. Friedrich actually painted a portrait of his 3 Russian friends together.
The one where they're wearing the old German clothes.
That's the one, by the Elbe River, with symbols of poetry in the railing. A real testament to that idea of romantic friendship, that spiritual connection the Romantics valued so highly.
And Zhukovsky himself was an artist, influenced by Friedrich.
A gifted amateur artist, yes. And you can definitely see Friedrich's influence in his drawings, that use of an empty foreground, views from windows, that emotional landscape quality. He built up a major collection of Friedrich's work to 9 paintings, over 50 drawings in his St. Petersburg apartment.
And that apartment became a cultural hub.
It did. The sources say on Saturdays, St. Petersburg's intellectual elite, poets, musicians, artists, would gather there. People saw the apartment, with Friedrich's art, as an extension of Zhukovsky's own melancholic, dreamy soul. He really spread Friedrich's vision in Russia. He even had an arrangement for Friedrich to send him 2 small paintings every year.
Wow, and this support became critical later on.
Incredibly important. After Friedrich had a stroke in 1835, which partly paralyzed him and mostly limited him to drawing and watercolor,
Zhukovsky stepped in.
He did. He carefully selected a group of these late graphic works and persuaded the Grand Duke, now Tsar Nicholas I, to buy them for a significant amount of money. This was a lifeline for the impoverished Friedrich and his family. The sources describe these late drawings as his artistic testament, surprisingly bright and expressive, despite his limitations.
So that Russian connection was much more than just money. It was this deep cultural exchange that sustained him personally and spread his influence internationally.
Exactly. Zhukovsky and Alexander Turgenev really strengthened those German-Russian cultural links. And through them, Friedrich's ideas about nature speaking to the soul influenced Russian landscape painters. His mountain scenes, for instance, really struck a chord there.
But despite that Russian support, his reputation back in Germany was fading in his later years.
Sadly, yes. The sources confirm that over his last 15 years or so, Romanticism itself was kind of going out of fashion. New artistic trends were emerging. Friedrich was increasingly seen as a bit eccentric, maybe out of touch.
Patrons drifted away.
By 1820, he was described as most solitary of the solitary. He lived in relative poverty towards the end, became more isolated, just spent long periods walking alone in nature.
And the stroke in 1835 really limited what he could physically do.
It did. He could mostly work in watercolor, sepia, maybe rework older ideas. His eyesight was okay, but his hand wasn't strong. He did manage one final notable oil painting, Seashore by Moonlight, from 1835-36, which the sources say is known for its really dark tones. Symbols of death also became more frequent then.
He died in 1840, relatively unnoticed.
Largely unnoticed by the wider art world, yes. Died May 7, 1840, in Dresden. Buried in Trinity Cemetery, the very entrance he'd painted years before. His death barely made a ripple at the time. His wife was left poor and died later in difficult circumstances.
And then his work just vanished for decades.
Pretty much complete obscurity for almost 50 years. After his friends and supporters died, he was largely forgotten. Carl Gustav Caruso wrote a tribute, acknowledging his importance, but basically positioning him as belonging firmly to the past, not a continuing influence. Almost none of his work was reproduced.
So how did he come back? How was he rediscovered?
It started slowly, around 1890. The symbolist painters began to notice him that depth, that emotional intensity resonated with them. But the big turning point was an exhibition in Berlin in 1906. 32 of his paintings were shown, and that really sparked renewed interest.
And from there, his influence just spread everywhere.
It really did.
Sure.
Symbolists like Edvard Munch, you can see the Rückenfigur in his Lonely Ones. Expressionists, surrealists like Max Ernst, René Magritte. The human condition echoes Friedrich's window paintings. Even British artists like Paul Nash, his painting Totes Meer, the sea of wrecked aircraft, was clearly influenced by Friedrich's Sea of Ice.
And beyond Europe, too.
Yeah, influenced American painters writer, the Hudson River School Luminists, who shared that interest in light and spirit in landscape. Back in Russia, painters like Quingy and Shishkin. And then major 20th century figures, Rothko, Gerhard Richter, Anselm Kiefer, all cited him.
Even Samuel Beckett.
Apparently. Sources suggest Beckett was influenced by man and woman contemplating the moon when writing Waiting for Godot. It's an incredible range.
That Rothko link keeps coming up, the abstract sublime.
Yes, the art historian Robert Rosenblum made that connection explicitly. Friedrich, Turner, Rothko. The idea that standing before a Rothko color field is like being the monk in Monk by the Sea, contemplating this vast, silent, emotive space.
But his rediscovery wasn't smooth sailing, was it? There was that major issue with the Nazis.
A really damaging chapter. In the 1930s, the Nazi regime tried to co-opt his work, twisting it to fit their blood and soil ideology, presenting him as this purely nationalist figure. That association really tainted his reputation for decades after the war.
Made it hard to see the work clearly.
Absolutely. Critics like Kenneth Clark in the late 40s just dismissed him, called his technique frigid. You can see how the political baggage damaged his standing, and sometimes his imagery got simplified or misused in horror films, which didn't help either.
So how is his name finally cleared, his reputation rehabilitated?
It took dedicated work by art historians Werner Hoffmann, Helmut Bursch-Supan, who did the big catalog raisonné, Sigrid Hinz. They systematically challenged the Nazi interpretations, placed him properly in art history, and allowed people to see his work fresh, without that political filter.
And where does he stand now?
By the late 70s, he was being shown internationally again, finding favor with new critics, new audiences. Today, he's a giant, internationally recognized, a German icon, hugely respected. The sources portray him now as this complex figure, a believer who struggled with doubt, haunted by darkness, but also celebrating immense beauty and the divine in nature.
There's a quote in the sources from William Vaughan saying he sort of transcended interpretation, reaching across cultures with the power of his images, emerging like a butterfly from obscurity.
That's a lovely way to put it. He broke free from just being a German painter or just a melancholy painter.
So wrapping this up, what this deep dive really shows is Friedrich's unique contribution, doesn't it? He didn't just paint landscapes. He changed what landscape painting could be. He invited you, the listener, the viewer, into this emotional, spiritual dialogue.
Using nature as a doorway to these huge themes, faith, loss, hope, the sublime. His techniques, the Rückenfigur, the symbols, the mood, were revolutionary. And they still pull us in because the art leaves space for your inner world to meet the painting. It feels personal. And that makes it feel totally contemporary.
And the sources suggest his work really meets the moment now, doesn't it? This time of reflecting on our place in nature, just like his time was. His paintings give us that space to pause, to think about our relationship with the world, with something bigger than us.
He just had this amazing ability to take simple things, rocks, trees, mist, sky, and make them profoundly poetic, inviting that quiet contemplation.
Which brings us back to Friedrich hoping future generations might find different feelings in his work than his own. So the final thought for you listening, after exploring all this, what feelings, what ideas does Caspar David Friedrich stir in you today? How do his vast, sometimes lonely, but always powerful, infinitive landscapes make you feel about that world beyond yourself?